Hey y'all, we're gonna start chapter 8 today. So if you remember from the last section that we read about Louis and Phil and his whole crew. They're goofing off, they're pulling jokes. They finally get their first air raid that they do, and they raid the island of Wake, which has a Japanese fortress on it. I guess military base, maybe that's a better word. They make it back okay, and they start to get this idea that maybe the war will be finished within a year. Some of the men think that, but these guys feels like, I don't think so. I think we're being a little premature. So the next chapter that we're reading is titled Dying in Droves. Droves is a term that you use for a group. I'm not sure what animal it is that is like that is a drove, but it's a group. So dying in droves is what this chapter is named. Okay. Before dawn on January 8th, 1943, a B-24 taxied to a beachside runway on Kauai, ready for a training flight. Aboard were Superman's former co-pilot, George Mosnet, and 5 other officers from Louis and Phil's barracks. The plane lifted off and disappeared into the darkness. At sunrise, Louis and Phil got the news. The plane was missing. So these guys that are their friends that have that used to be in their plane crew are now missing in the plane that they went up in that morning. They rushed to Kauai and walked the beach looking for any sign of their friends. A slip of paper washed ashore. It was a paycheck made out to Mosnet. Later that morning, the plane was found lying on the ocean floor just offshore. All 10 of the crew were dead. The plane had barely made it past takeoff, clearing the runway, turning and slamming into the water. Several men had tried to swim ashore, but the sharks had found them. The men were, as Louis wrote in his diary, ripped to pieces. Louis was shaken. He'd been in Hawaii for only 2 months, and yet already several dozen men that he knew from his bombing group, including 6 of his 16 men in his barracks, were dead. First loss came on the flight from the States when a B-24 vanished. Then a plane caught fire and crashed and killed 4 men. Another plane hit a mountain, killing everybody aboard. A bomber crash-landed, killing 2. Another exploded in midair. Only 3 men survived, including one whose hand happened to be resting on a parachute when the blast flung him from the plane. A plane photographing Wake was shot down, then Mosnet's crash. Out of these crashes, only one was caused by enemy action, but this wasn't unusual. In World War II, some 36,000 Army Air Force planes were lost in combat and accidents. The surprise is how many were lost in accidents. In 1943, in the region in which Louis served, for every plane lost in combat, some 6 planes were lost in accidents. Okay, so let's do the math on this. Okay, so for every 1 plane that they lose in battle, there are 6 that are lost with accidents. So think about how many plane accidents are happening. Why is that? Okay. In the war, almost 36,000 airmen died in non-battle situations, and the vast majority of these were in accidental crashes. Often, the culprit was the plane. So a lot of times the issue was the plane. Why they're crashing so much. In January of 1943 alone, Louis encountered 10 serious mechanical problems in the planes in which he flew, including 2 engine failures and a jammed landing gear. Once, Superman's brakes failed on the landing. By the time that Phil stopped the plane, it was 3 feet short of the runway's end, which ended with the ocean. So look, there's a picture of a plane crash. So think about that. Could you imagine? I hate flying. It's like one of my least favorite things to do. And in 1 month that Louis is flying, he has 10 accidents. that are almost death-causing but not. So think about that. Oh, that's awful. So there's the main thing that's the issue is the planes. Tropical weather was another danger. Once, as Phil detoured around a squall, which is a huge storm on the ocean, Cuppernail asked if he'd dare to fly into it. "I can fly this thing anywhere," Phil said, turning into the storm. It was a near fatal mistake. Superman was swallowed. Wind pivoted it sideways and it began porpoising. So porpoising is like the plane's going up and down like this, like a dolphin. Swooping up and down like a swimming dolphin, leaving the men clinging to anything bolted down. They'd been at only 1,000 feet when they entered the storm. Now, with no visibility and the plane pitching wildly, they didn't know where the ocean was. Each time the plane plunged, the men braced for a crash. Oahu had been in sight a moment before, but now they'd lost all sense of location. Pillsbury strapped on his parachute. Radio man Harry Brooks saved them. He found a signal from a Hawaiian station and determined the direction from which it was coming. Phil hauled the plane around and towards the signal home. When they landed, he was exhausted, his shirt wet with sweat. Runways were another problem. So we've got tropical weather, we have plane failures, and then runways are the third problem. Runways were another problem. Many islands were so small that coral had to be plowed onto one end to create enough length for an airstrip. Even then, the runways were often too short. So many planes shot off of Funafuti's runway into the ocean that the ground crews kept a bulldozer equipped with a towing cable parked by the water. For loaded B-24s, which needed well over 4,000 feet for takeoff, the cropped island runways, often abutted by towering palm trees, were a challenge. The takeoff proved exciting, wrote Staff Sergeant Frank Rosnick of one overload departure. The plane lumbered down the runway for an eternity, and we could see the hard-packed coral through the cracks in the bomb bay doors. And then there was a whoosh, and pieces of palm frond suddenly appeared jammed in the cracks on both sides. Only the laundry knew how scared I was. Then there was human error, so human mess-ups. Pilots flew or taxied planes into each other. In B-24s, notorious for fuel leaks, airmen lit cigarettes and blew up their planes. Louis was once asked to fill in on a crew, but feeling sick, he declined. On that same flight, the tower warned the pilot of a mountain ahead. The pilot saw it and said he saw it, then flew right into it. On another flight, when a bomber flew sharply upward, a falling crewman inadvertently grabbed the life release handle. The life raft sprang from the roof and wrapped around the plane's tail. Barely able to control the plane, the pilot ordered his men out. Somehow, he landed and everyone survived. Finally, there was navigation. See, all these problems with planes. Employing a crowd of instruments, navigators groped over thousands of miles of ocean towards tiny islands that were blacked out at night and flat to the horizon. Procedures could be comically primitive. To get the sextant of things, one navigator had to stand on a table and dangle out on the roof hatch while a crewman held his legs so he wouldn't be sucked out. Given how difficult navigation was, it's amazing that any crews found their destinations, but many didn't. The risks of flying were compounded in combat as planes faced enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Bunching together to fend off fighters and hitting narrow target islands, planes often collided, fired on each other, and worse. In one accident, as 3 B-24s flew together through a canyon under fire, 2 of them bumped into each other. The collision sent Lieutenant Robert Strong's bomber under the plane. He bumped just as the plane dropped a giant mine. The mine crashed into Strong's plane, tearing an 18-foot square hole in the fuselage, cutting the plane almost in half. Impossibly, Strong flew the plane 800 miles home as a gaping crack advanced up the fuselage and the tail flapped behind. Later, when a pilot pulled on the tail, it nearly came off in his hand. These combat risks created grim statistics. In World War II, 5 52,173 airmen were killed in action. A Pacific bomber's crewman's tour of duty was just 40 missions. His chances of getting killed before he fulfilled it were 50%. So Louis is in this crew. So bombers, out of the bombers that go on 40 missions, only half of them return alive. That's a lot. That's a very high risk. Stricken Pacific bombers usually came down on water. Every airman had a life vest that was called a Mae West after the busty movie star. Survivors had to get into the rafts immediately because sharks often followed in vast numbers almost the moment when planes hit. Once, coming upon a crash site, the Superman's crew saw this firsthand. Hundreds of sharks, some of them that looked about 20 feet long, were swirling around the life rafts on the verge of overturning them. The survivors were rescued, but Superman's crew were horrified. So Louis' crew comes across this downed plane, and it's very close after it has been downed, and they see hundreds of sharks surrounding the life rafts, and that kind of scars them for life. In 1943, Louis' USC track teammate, Art Reading, was knocked unconscious as he ditched his plane and landed it on the water. As the plane sank, Reading's navigator, Everett Allman, pulled Reading out and lashed himself to him. As Reading woke, Allman began towing him towards the nearest island, 20 miles away. The sharks began circling. One swept in, bit Allman's leg, and dove, dragging both men under. Then something gave away, and the men surfaced in a pool of blood. Allman's leg had apparently been torn off. He gave his Mae West to Reading and then sank away. For 18 hours, Reading floated, kicked, and hacking at attacking sharks, was stranded before a search boat found him. For good reason, sharks were feared and loathed by airmen. On one island, it was a popular pastime to lure them into jetties with bait tied to long sticks and then lob grenades into their mouths. When the sharks snatched the bait, the men would watch them blow up. So think about, that's horrible. All these. So you have a 50-50 chance of surviving when you go up in a plane, basically. And then, if you do come down and you do happen to survive when the plane comes down, then you're going to get eaten by the sharks. For downed men, the odds of rescue were very poor. Many crews went down without sending up a distress call, so rescuers had no idea where they had crashed. Often the military didn't even learn planes were missing until they failed to land at their destination, sometimes as long as 16 hours after the crash. To make things worse, the life rafts could drift dozens of miles a day. Because of this, search areas often extended over thousands of square miles. If searchers did fly near a raft, they likely wouldn't see it. Though search planes generally flew just at 1,000 feet, even from that height, rafts could be mistaken for waves. To avoid stalling, many rescue planes had to be flown so fast that the men could only look at for a moment to scan each area before it was gone. The sad truth, known to Louis Phil and all the other airmen, was that the vast majority of downed men were never found. The improbability of rescue, coupled with the soaring rate of accidental crashes, created a terrible equation. Search planes appeared to have been more likely to go down themselves than to find the men that they were looking for. It's likely that for every man rescued, several would-be rescuers died. Hunger, thirst, and exposure depleted raft-bound men with frightening rapidity. Some died in days. So if you managed to survive the sharks and you were in the raft, exposure to the sun, the heat, and no water would kill you also. Some died in days. Others went insane. In 1942, a bomber crashed in the Pacific, stranding 9 men on a raft. Within a few days, one had died and the rest of them had gone crazy. 2 heard music and baying dogs. 2 fought over an imaginary case of beer. Another shouted curses at the sky that he believed was full of bombers. Seeing a boat that wasn't even there, he leapt overboard and drowned. When the men were rescued on day 7, they were too weak to even wave their arms. Of all the horrors facing downed men, the most feared was to get captured by the Japanese. The roots of this fear lay in an event that occurred in 1937, early in Japan's invasion of China. The Japanese military surrounded the city of Nanking, stranding civilians and 90,000 Chinese soldiers who surrendered. The officers issued an order to execute all prisoner of wars. Oh, so think about this. They're afraid of the Japanese. The Japanese were horrible during World War II. So the reason why they're afraid of them, 90,000 soldiers and civilians, that's together. So more than 100,000 people surrender. And when you surrender, you're supposed to treat them with terms of war, which means that you give them food, water, you keep them in prison, but you keep them safe. Okay? So they all surrender, the Chinese do. And the Japanese execute all of them. 90,000 plus people in one day. They execute all of them. What followed was a 6-week frenzy of killing. Prisoners were beheaded, machine gunned, bayoneted, that's stabbed with the sword on the end of a gun, burned alive. The Japanese turned on civilians, staging killing contests, raping tens of thousands of people, mutilating and crucifying them. The Japanese press rallies of killing contests praising their contestants. Historians estimate that the Japanese murdered between 200,000 and 430,000 Chinese, including 90,000 prisoners of war, in what became known as the Rape of Nanking. Every airman knew about that incident, and since then, Japan had reinforced the precedent. In Louis' squadron, there was a rumor that on a Japanese territory in the Marshall Islands called Kwajalein, prisoners were murdered. The men called it Execution Island. It is testament to the reputation of the Chinese that in one doomed B-24 falling over Japanese forces, only one man bailed out. The rest were so afraid of capture that they chose to die in the crash. So people are so afraid of them that they would rather die in the airplane than jump out and be saved and possibly rescued by the Japanese. For airmen, the risk could not be ignored. The dead were their roommates, their friends, the crew flying off their wing 10 seconds ago. Men didn't die one by one. A quarter of the barracks perished at once. Barracks are where they lived, their bedrooms. There were rarely funerals, for there were rarely any bodies. Airmen didn't speak of death, but privately they were tormented with fear. Before Louis had left the States, he'd been issued a Bible. He tried reading it to soothe his anxiety, but it didn't make any sense to him. So he often left Phil, sprawled on his bed, penning love letters to Cece as he ran off his worries in the mile course that he'd measured around the runway. He also tried to prepare for every contingency, even taking an elderly Hawaiian seminar on fending off sharks. Open your eyes wide, bare your teeth, and bop the shark in the nose. Phil carried 2 good luck charms. One was a bracelet that Cece had given him. Believing it protected him, he wouldn't fly without it. The other was a silver dollar. When he finally ran away with Cece, he said he'd use it to tip the bellboy. "When I do get home," he wrote her, "I'm going to hide with you where no one will find us." As Oahu's airmen died in droves, a ritual began. When a man was killed, his friends would open his locker, take out his liquor, and have a drink in his honor. In a war without funerals, it was the best that they could do. Talk to y'all tomorrow.